I'm going to start by going through the different pieces that we're going to need for our Amour shoulder bag, depending on which features you want to include in your bag. So no matter what, you are going to need your main panel linings. These are going to be a solid piece. There's not a seam in the middle for the lining at least. So we're going to need 2 of these for the inside of the bag. And we are going to interface both of these with woven interfacing. Now for the exterior of your bag, you can either choose to have the pieced version, which is what I have here. So you're gonna see we're gonna have kind of half of the piece. This will get sewn together and there'll be a seam in the middle. Or you can also use the same piece that's used for the lining and just make a solid exterior piece. So those are gonna be our main panels that we need depending on which style you want. If you are doing the split version here, then obviously you'll need 2 pair. So you have one for each side of the bag, the front and back. Next, we're going to look at the gusset pieces. So you're going to need a lining for your gusset. We have 2 options for that. So first we have just the solid lining gusset, or if you decide that you want to include the divider zipper pocket, you're going to actually have 2 lining gusset pieces. And these are essentially mirrored. If you look closely, you're going to see that there is a long curved edge and a long straight edge. And so you'll have 2 of these, which are ultimately going to be sewn together with our divider zipper pocket in between them. And so the final width will be the same as if you do the solid version of that lining gusset. So then, of course, if you're doing the version of the gusset that requires the divider zipper pocket, then you need the pieces for the divider zipper pocket. So for that, we're going to have 4 of the same piece here. So we're going to have 2 exterior divider pocket pieces and then 2 lining divider pocket pieces. And I've also interfaced all of these as well as my gusset pieces with woven interfacing. And then you will need a small zipper tab piece to go along with this. Finally, if you are doing the pieced gusset as opposed to the solid exterior gusset, we are going to need quite a few pieces depending on which version you want. Now there is a solid gusset piece that I just don't have out in front of me right now. Even if you have what's called the solid exterior gusset, you're still gonna have these gusset top pieces because these are gonna go right below our O-ring connectors. So these are required for any version of the exterior gusset. Then we have some options. So if you want to include the vertical zipper pocket, for each vertical zipper pocket, you can do 1 or 2 or none, but if you're including that, then you're going to need 2 mirrored gusset zipper pocket pieces with your exterior fabric, and then 2 mirrored gusset zipper pocket pieces for your lining fabric. For each of these zipper pockets, you're also going to need a middle gusset lining piece because this will end up being the back inside part of our finished zipper pocket on the gusset. So you'll need 1 of those for each pocket. And then if you are doing a solid version, well, the piece version, but without the zipper pocket on the gusset exterior, then you're just going to need an exterior middle gusset piece, and that's what this one is. So this one is going to end up the same size as the version of it that has that vertical zipper pocket. So on this example, I'm doing one side of the bag that doesn't have that pocket and one side of the bag that does have that pocket, which is why I have this set of the gusset zipper pocket pieces and then one that is just the middle gusset piece. Finally, for our overall pieced exterior gusset, we are going to need the bottom. So the bottom can be done still in woven material, but I really like to do it in a faux leather or vinyl material. Now, all of my woven pieces that I've shown here, I have interfaced with a woven interfacing. The vinyl, I'm not going to interface with that because it's just not needed since it is a heavier material, but we are going to be using some stabilizer. The stabilizer for this bag is not too much, so we're going to need 1 piece of Decoville Light for the bottom of the gusset. Or if you're doing the solid exterior gusset, that's just 1 piece aside from this little top portion, then you can go ahead and fuse your Decoville Light centered on that piece now. But if you're doing this version that has the seam down the middle, then we're going to have to sew these together first, top stitch, and then we'll be fusing this piece on later. Other than that, for stabilizer, we're just going to have these little strips that are going to be used as stabilizer on our O-ring connectors. So then we have our O-ring connectors here, just these little rectangles, and we can go ahead and fuse the stabilizer for those just down the center long ways. If you are doing the main panel that is just a solid piece and not pieced, then you're going to skip this part because yours will already be the full shape. This is my lining, but this is the same shape you will have if you are just using the solid main panel. But if you are doing the pieced main panel, you're going to take 2 of your main panel pieces that are mirrored. We're going to put these right sides together, and then along this straight edge, we're going to clip together, and then we're going to be sewing this at 3/8 inch seam allowance. I have those 2 panels sewn together now. I'm going to open it up, and I'm just going to finger press the seam open. If you're using a woven material, you could take an iron and you could press this as well, just depends on the materials you're using, obviously. And then I'm going to take this back to my sewing machine, and I'm going to top stitch along both sides of the seam at 1/8, that's 1/8 inch seam allowance. I have that top stitched, and now I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same steps with my other set of main panels. So I'm going to sew them together at 3/8 inch seam allowance, open that seam, and then top stitch at 1/8 inch seam allowance from the middle seam. So we have these main panels sewn, and next thing is if you have a bag tag you would like to attach, we're going to attach that now. I recommend placing it centered along that seam and placed about 3 inches up from the bottom. If you are doing a solid panel, then you'll just have to find your center point and again measure up about 3 inches. You don't have to place it exactly there, you could place it where you would like, but I do recommend placing it at least 1 inch away from any of the edges just to make sure it doesn't get caught in any future seam allowance. My main panels are now finished for now. I've added my bag tag, and we can just set these aside for now. Next thing I'm going to work on is a gusset zipper pocket. Now, if you are not including the gusset zipper pocket, then you are probably just going to have a solid middle gusset piece that looks like this. So you don't necessarily have to include these vertical zipper pockets on the gusset. If you are not including that, then you're going to skip ahead, but if you are, I'm going to show you how to assemble those. For the zipper pocket, we are going to need a length of number 5 zipper tape and 1 zipper pull. And then we're also going to need 2 mirrored gusset zipper pocket pieces for your exterior, and then a mirrored pair for your lining. And then we're not going to use this quite yet, but you are also going to need a middle gusset lining piece, and this is going to make the back inside part of the zipper pocket. So first we are going to take one of these lining pieces, and we're going to mark 1/2 inch down from the top on one of our straight edges. So if you look at these pieces and you're holding them so that they're mirrored properly, you should have a straight long edge, and then you have this angled slanted long edge. So it's still a straight line, but it's slanted instead of straight up and down. So on this inside part, which is where the zipper tape is going to attach, we're going to mark 1/2 inch down. And then we're going to take our zipper tape. You do not have to put the zipper pull on yet, but you could. I will explain when you definitely need to put that on in just a little bit. We're going to open this up just about 2 inches or so. You don't have to be exact here. You just want it to be separated at the top part so that you're able to work with it. And we're going to pinch, so I'm doing the other side, this over. If you just pinch the zipper tape, it's going to cause the zipper tape to fold. Just like that. Now, some people like to take this to the machine and tack it with some stitches. I prefer to clip it, but if you'd rather do that with stitching it, you can go ahead and do that now. But I'm going to line this up so that the teeth are right below that mark we just made. And I'm going to just clip it to the lining fabric. And then we're going to go ahead and clip that all the way down on this straight edge. And you are doing this with your lining right side up and the zipper tape also right side up. I'm going to go ahead and take this to my machine now, and I'm going to just baste the zipper tape to that lining piece, making sure that the top of the zipper tape stays folded. You will see that you probably have a little bit of extra overhang on your zipper tape at the bottom. It's cut a little bit long just to make sure you have some extra wiggle room depending on exactly how you fold the top part there. So next I'm going to take one of my exterior pieces. Now you need to make sure you're using the correct one. So if I was to take this, you can see that this side facing up matches, but it's going to be flipped upside down. So that means that this is not the right one. This one gets paired with this lining. This is the one I need. Make sure that when you line this up, all of your edges are matching up correctly. You should have the straight up and down side together and that slanted side together. It should all match. So I'm going to take my exterior piece of the pocket. I'm going to lay it wrong side up over top, sandwiching the zipper tape in between. And I'm going to go ahead and just clip it along that same straight up and down edge that we already basted. And then I'm going to be taking this and sewing it on my machine with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I have that sewn. Now I'm actually going to take a second and just trim that zipper tape so that it is matched up with the bottom of that fabric. And that's going to just make it easier when we are matching up the other side. I'm going to open this up and finger press it open, folding back both the lining and the exterior so that they are wrong sides together. And now I'm going to take this and I'm going to top stitch down this seam along the zipper. And then I'm also going to baste the other 3 sides to hold the exterior and lining together. This side is now done, and I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same things with the other side of the zipper tape and my other pieces of my zipper pocket. So I'm going to start again by folding down the zipper at the top, basting it to the lining, and then sewing the exterior over top of that, turn it right side out, and top stitch everything. Now this portion of the zipper pocket is put together. We're going to go ahead and install our zipper pull. So we get that zipper pull put on there. Make sure you do that now, or you'll be sad when you can't fit it on later. Now we're going to take our gusset middle lining piece. So if you're doing this with the zipper pocket, this should be a lining piece. And we're going to mark the top and bottom center points. I'm going to do it just by making really small notches. You could also just do this with a marking pen. Then we are going to lay this part of the assembled zipper pocket over top, and the zipper tape should match up with those notches. And I'm just going to clip it at the top and bottom. Now at the top, your zipper tape doesn't go all the way to the top, so just make sure that it is directly below that center point that you've marked. And we're going to clip it. And you will see that the part of the zipper pocket you've already made is going to be bigger than that middle gusset piece. That is just to allow you to trim it down when everything is put together here, as we're about to do, for a really nice clean finish to make everything fits. So next we're going to put together our exterior gusset bottom. So you'll notice that you've got slightly curved or slanted longer edges here. And then the 2 shorter sides of the piece is going to have a shortest side and then a little bit longer side, right? So we have this wider section and this narrower section compared to these slanted sides. So we're going to be putting together the longer straight edges here. This is going to make up the middle of the bag, so it's also the widest part of the gusset. So using these wider edges here, we're going to put these together, right sides together, and clip now along that wider straight edge. Then we're going to take this to the machine and go ahead and sew that at 3/8 inch seam allowance. I've sewn that together. Now I'm going to open this up and finger press open that seam. And I'm going to go ahead and take this to my machine now. And I'm going to top stitch along both sides of that seam at 1/8 of an inch. That is now nicely top stitched. Because we had to assemble that, we haven't fused our stabilizer, which is Decovil Light, on this piece yet. So you can go ahead and fuse that now. So you're fusing your Decovil Light stabilizer to the wrong side of this assembled gusset bottom. Now we are going to create our O-ring connectors. So I have one that's already prepped here, and then I have my other O-ring connector strip. We are also going to need the ends of our exterior gusset. So I have those ready to go. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark a center line on the O-ring connector. I'm going to mark that center line by measuring 3/4 of an inch away from a long edge. Then I'm going to take a strip of double-sided tape and I'm going to place it directly on top of that line. And then we're going to be folding our raw edges in to that center line and sticking it to the double-sided tape. You could do this without double-sided tape and just clip it because it is a pretty short strip. All right, then I'm going to be taking this to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch along both folded long edges at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I have sewn both of my O-ring connectors by top stitching. Now, depending on the material, this is optional, but you can use something like fray check to go ahead and just go along that center part where you have the raw edges, just to make sure that over time you don't have any fraying. This isn't necessarily something you need to do, but depending on the material, it's something you could choose to do just to make sure that you don't have any fraying in the future. Now I need to connect my O-ring connectors to the top piece of our exterior gusset. So first I'm going to mark the top and bottom center points. We're really only going to use the bottom center point right now, but we're going to mark both just so we have it done for later. And then I'm going to take one of my O-ring connectors and I'm going to line it up with the bottom center point of one of these top gusset pieces. So now our O-ring connectors are ready to go and we can set these aside until we finish assembling the exterior gusset. Now it's time to put together our exterior gusset if you are doing the pieced version. So I'm going to take my bottom gusset piece, which also should have Decovil Light fused to the wrong side, and then I'm going to take one of my middle gusset pieces. Now your middle gusset could be just a solid piece like this, or it could be a zipper pocket. I am using for this bag one of each. You could be using 2 of just the solid or 2 of the zipper pockets. That's up to you. Either way, the assembly for this exterior gusset is going to be the same. So I'm going to take the wider edge, wider straight edge of one of my middle pieces, which is going to be the bottom. When you're using a zipper pocket, it should be kind of obvious because that is, again, at the bottom of our zipper tape. And we're going to match this up with one of the shorter edges of our bottom gusset. And we're putting these right sides together, and we're going to clip that together. And then we are going to go ahead and sew this together on the machine at 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that is sewn, and I'm going to open it up and I'm going to kind of finger press this seam down, and we're going to top stitch along the edge on sewing on the bottom gusset piece. We are not pressing open the seam. So if we look at the other side, the entire seam allowance should be going towards the bottom gusset piece, and we are going to top stitch on the bottom gusset piece 1/8 of an inch from that seam. So that is now top stitched, and I'm going to now repeat those same steps with my other middle gusset piece and the other end of my bottom gusset. So I'm going to be sewing these together at 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to finger press the seam down towards the bottom gusset and top stitch. So now we have attached both of our middle gusset pieces to our bottom gusset piece, and now we need to attach our gusset ends. Your gusset end pieces should already have your O-ring connector basted to the bottom edge. That bottom edge is the wider edge, and this is the edge we're going to be sewing with now. So we're going to take this and put it right sides together with one of the ends on our middle gusset. Clip that together, and we're going to go ahead and take this and sew it at 3/8 inch seam allowance. So that gusset end piece is now sewn on. Now I'm going to take this piece and I am going to fold it out and finger press. We are going to be top stitching on the gusset end piece. So this is where we're top stitching, and you can see that my entire seam allowance is going up towards the very far end of this gusset end piece, but my O-ring connector is actually going to be laying down towards the middle piece and the bottom piece. So it's pointing in that direction, but our gusset end piece is pointing in the other direction. So we are not going to be sewing through an extra layer of this O-ring. We're going to be top stitching along this edge at 1/8 inch seam allowance. So I have this end top stitched, and I'm going to go ahead and repeat the same steps now with the other end. So I'm going to be laying my gusset end piece right side together with the raw edge at the end of my middle gusset piece. I'm going to sew this together at 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to top stitch it the same way I did for the first one. So now my exterior gusset is all assembled. I have all of the pieces put together. So on this piece, I've already fused the stabilizer since I don't have anything to assemble here. Now to finish assembling the solid exterior gusset, we do need to attach our gusset end pieces. In a previous step, I've already prepared the O-ring connector and attached it or basted it to this gusset end piece. So working with one of our short ends on this solid gusset piece, we're going to take our gusset end piece, and using the end that is connected to the O-ring connector, we are just going to clip these right sides together. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew along this edge at 3/8 inch seam allowance. I've sewn my gusset end piece here, and now I'm going to be top stitching. So for this, I want my seam allowance to be going up towards the gusset end piece. I'm going to finger press the gusset end piece down, but my O-ring connector is actually going to stay going towards the middle of the gusset piece. Not up towards the end, but towards the middle. This is really going to reduce bulk, and this is going to be finished being connected together at the very end of our bag assembly. So I'm going to go ahead now and top stitch along this seam at 1/8 inch seam allowance. And I'm sewing through the gusset end piece as well as the seam allowance underneath, but not through that O-ring connector. This end is all finished, and I'm going to go ahead and do exactly the same thing to the other end of the gusset. Now that I have both of my gusset end pieces attached to the solid exterior gusset, this piece is ready to go and we can move on. We are now going to assemble the divider zipper pocket. This is an optional feature for the bag, but if you are including the divider zipper pocket, you are going to need 2 divider zipper pocket pieces in your exterior, 2 in lining, your zipper tape, and then your zipper end. So to get started, we're going to have to prepare our zipper tape. So we are going to take our zipper end, and you see it there as a slightly longer edge and a slightly shorter edge. We're going to fold our shorter edges into the middle, and then we're going to fold that in again. Now usually just finger pressing this is enough because we're going to be clipping it to our zipper tape in just a moment. Before you attach your zipper end, you do need to install your zipper pull. Because of the way that this is put together, you cannot wait to install your zipper pull until later. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Once my zipper pull is on there, I'm not going to push it all the way down, just put it in about the middle. And I'm going to take that zipper end piece that I've already folded and just slip it over the end of the zipper tape. So now at this point, my zipper end should be clipped to the end where the zipper would be opening towards, and then the zipper is being closed towards the other end. I'm going to go ahead and take this to the sewing machine and just base stitch that zipper end piece on to the zipper tape. I'm I'm going to go ahead and take this to the sewing machine and top stitch that zipper end piece onto the zipper tape. So I have my zipper end attached to my zipper and my zipper pull has been installed. Now I'm going to open up just about an inch or so of the zipper tape, and I'm going to measure and mark 3/8 of an inch from the end of the zipper tape. And then I'm going to pinch in right at that mark. So that's what I'm going to pinch between my fingers, and that's going to make the zipper tape fold at a right angle. I'm going to kind of just lay that fold down and clip it in place. Now I like to just keep it clipped until I clip it to whatever fabric I'm using, but you may choose to sew a tack stitch there just to hold it in place if that is your preference. I'm going to take one of my lining pieces, and I want to point something out on this lining first. If you look at the divider pocket pieces, you're going to see that we have this curve, and then there's a short straight edge at the top. So we have this sort of inner corner where the curve meets this short straight part at the top. And we're going to be using that little corner between the curve and this little straight portion to know where to place our zipper tape. So I am going to have a lining pocket right side up and my zipper tape right side up, and we're going to be matching up the edge that we have clipped our folded zipper tape. So make sure that you're choosing the correct side of your zipper tape. I am going to line up the folded edge of the zipper end here just below that sort of corner part. It should be no more than 1/4 inch away. It should be right below where that corner is, and I'm going to clip that together. And then I'm going to clip along the zipper tape. Now you can also use some double-sided tape here if that helps you to make sure your zipper tape is laying correctly. I like to just use a lot of clips, and I feel with my fingers to make sure I'm really closely following that curve well. If you don't follow the curve nicely while you are attaching this zipper tape, then your pocket is going to end up not laying correctly. It's going to be a little warped. So you can use double-sided tape here, or like I said, just a lot of clips to make sure everything is staying in place and not shifting. When you get to the other end, the top of your fold, the end of your zipper tape, right where the folded teeth are basically, should end up sitting just below the place where that, again, top short edge meets the curve. So where that little internal corner is. And mine does, whoops, I kind of made my fold come apart there. So I'm going to clip that together. It should sit right there. Now, if yours doesn't, if your fold maybe was a little bit off and yours is going to be past where that sort of corner part is, you can refold your zipper tape to make sure it's just below that little corner. I'm going to go ahead and take this to my sewing machine, and I am going to base stitch it at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have my zipper tape basted to my divider pocket lining. Now I'm going to take an exterior divider pocket piece, and we're going to lay that face down, right side down, so right sides are together. And we're going to clip this together. I like to start by clipping together those short top edges, and then usually right next to it. And then I'll start to clip in the middle and then clip it along the rest of the way. So we're going to clip this all the way across, making sure everything is laying nicely. And then I'm going to be taking this and sewing it at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Keep in mind you may have to shift where your zipper pull is as you're sewing to make sure you can get a really nice even seam. It is important that you get a really consistent 3/8 inch seam allowance as you're sewing this. You are also sewing all the way across. So we're actually going to sew right at this straight little edge, and then I like to have my needle down and pivot, come down and around this curve until I get to just below where that, again, sort of inner corner is where the curve meets the straight edge. Have my needle down, pivot, and finish going across. I have that sewn, and now I'm going to need to make some notches and trim some of this seam allowance. So first I'm going to cut some notches, being very careful not to cut your stitches at those inner corners I've talked about. So where that curve meets the short straight edge, I'm going to actually cut a little triangle out because we want this to be able to bend and have some movement in there when we put things right side out. So I'm going to do this at both ends. You shouldn't need to be cutting through your zipper tape because of where you started and stopped. There we go. Then I'm also going to be trimming down the seam allowance of both the lining and exterior. However, I suggest not cutting through your zipper tape because over time that zipper tape can fray. Now, some people do like to trim their zipper tape in cases like this and then use a lighter to melt the edges, but it's not really necessary to trim the zipper tape at this point. It's really better to trim the lining and the exterior. So you can trim this down with some duck scissors, or also with pinking shears is great because that's going to create the notches essentially for you, which again, we want this curve to be able to kind of shift and not have extra bulk in there when we turn things right side out. So I like to start with my duck scissors. These are really helpful, and trim down the seam allowance. Again, being careful not to cut through any of our stitches. So I didn't cut through the zipper tape at all. I just cut through the seam allowance on the exterior, and now the same on the lining. Keep in mind that your lining is going to have a shorter or narrower seam allowance because you had basted this at 1/4 inch first before you did your actual stitching at 3/8 of an inch. And up to smart, perfect. I was able to trim mine pretty closely here, especially on that lining side. But again, you could also choose to use pinking shears, and you can also use some scissors along the curves to then also clip some notches or snips, making sure you don't get too close to your stitches, just again to allow some movement so you don't have that bulk. Things are able to lay nicely. Now I'm going to fold this to be right side out. Remember, we made this cut notch right at that corner. So we're going to actually push that up with your fingers. And I like to get a really nice, clean edge there. And I'm going to go ahead and clip that right away. And the same on the other side. Because I had that notch cut there, I should be able to get that folded. Oops. And clip in place. Then I'm going to finger press the rest of the way along this zipper tape. Now, because of this curve, this is going to lay kind of awkwardly at this point, but that's actually a good sign because it means that once this is all finished and your zipper tape is running along the top of the divider pocket, everything should be laying really nice and clean, because ultimately we want our zipper tape to kind of be on top and then the pocket to be coming straight down. So that'll make more sense later. So then I have this flipped so it is right side out, wrong sides together. I am going to top stitch right along the zipper tape at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Again, you should have a slight corner here. It's not going to be as distinct as it was before necessarily, but we're going to be stitching all the way across. So starting at the very end, make a few stitches before you pivot, go along this curve, and make sure you are shifting the fabric as you go, because it's not all going to lay flat at once because of the curve. So we're going to shift it as we go, making sure we get a really nice clean top stitch. Get to this other end, stitch across that little short edge for top stitching all the way. So this side of my divider pocket is done, and I'm going to go ahead and do all of those same steps with the other lining and exterior piece on the other side of my zipper tape. So again, I'm going to start out by folding down, pinching down my zipper tape here, and we can clip it or you can sew a tack stitch there. And I'm going to start my zipper end just below that corner, clip all the way across. I'm going to baste it. I'm going to sew on the exterior, flip it out and top stitch after I do that trimming. So all of the same steps, but with the other lining and exterior piece. So you can see I have sewn both pockets. If you were to try to lay this flat, obviously this doesn't lay nicely. But when I mentioned earlier that we are going to have those nice curves and everything's going to lay nicely, this is what I'm talking about. Our zipper tape is nice and flat on the top, and this is how the pocket is going to be in the bag, straight up and down. And now everything lays really nicely together, even though we had those curves that might have been a little finicky to sew. So now I'm going to match up all of the layers. So the lining and exterior from both sides, starting at the top corners, I'm going to clip that together, all 4 layers here. And then I'm going to make sure that all of the rounded corners are matching up. And just clip everything together at the rounded corners, and then eventually all the way around the bag. We're going to clip through all 4 layers. Once you have everything nicely lined up here, you're going to be taking it and basting together all the way around. So down the side, around the corner, across the bottom, around the corner, and up the other side, going all the way around the bag, just base stitching it together at 1/8 inch seam allowance. And you are going to start right at the very top corner. So we're going from this top corner down around until we get back to that other corner. So our interior divider pocket is now completed, and we're going to refer to this now going forward just as the divider pocket. And the next thing we're going to need to do is be attaching this to our gusset lining. Now, if you are making the divider pocket, then your gusset lining is going to be in 2 pieces. You're going to have these 2 long pieces that have a curved edge on one side and then a straight edge on the other long side, and our divider pocket is going to eventually be sewn to this straight edge. If you are using a divider pocket, then your gusset lining is going to be in 2 pieces. And so we are going to now show how we assemble this lining with this gusset, as well as attaching this whole gusset to our lining main panels. So as we go through this, you're going to need 2 main panels in your lining material. You're going to need your already assembled divider pocket. It should be just like this, and everything's already basted together, and our zipper tape is already all installed. And then you're going to have 2 lining split gusset pieces. Now, what's important to understand about these split gusset lining pieces, is that you'll see we have a completely straight long edge. If I put these together, they're going to go together really nicely. And then you're going to have a long edge that is slightly curved on each of these pieces. So this slightly curved edge of the gusset is what's going to get sewn to the main panel linings. And then this straight edge is going to be sewn with the divider pocket in between them, kind of like this. And then they'll continue to be sewn together when we get to the very ends. So make sure as you're working through this, I'll be referring to the straight edge at times, and then I'll be referring to the curved edge at times, and make sure you're working with the right long edge. So the first thing we're going to do with these pieces is make some marks. So along the straight edges on both of our split gusset lining pieces, we're going to measure down 5 inches, and we're going to make marks in the seam allowance. So I'm just going to mark at 5 inches down on both of those split gusset lining pieces, and I'm making that measurement and marking it along the straight edge. So I'm going to do it with the other end as well. And finally the last one. These markings are going to be used eventually to know where the top corners of the divider pocket should sit. So make sure you do have those marked out. Now to actually start putting this whole lining together, we're actually going to set these split gusset lining pieces aside for now, and we're going to work with one of the main panel linings and the divider pocket to start. So we're going to need to have some center points marked. So I've already made a really small notch in the bottom center point of my divider pocket. So mark that with a marking pen or with a small notch, depending on your materials. And then I'm also going to be marking both the top and bottom center points on my main panel lining. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So folding this in half. I like to match up these top corners because they are very narrow, and so you know you're starting correctly. And we're going to mark this top center point. I like to do this with just notches when it comes to this piece, and then making sure everything still stays together. We're also going to mark that bottom center point. There we go. And you'll do that with both of your lining pieces because you are going to need center points marked on each of those. Now that I have those center points marked, I am going to be grabbing one of my split gusset linings, and we're going to be working with the curved long edge at this point. So we're also going to need to mark our center points on these split gusset lining pieces. So I am going to mark the center points on both edges, so both the curved edge and the straight edge. But I'm going to be working right now with the curved edge for this first step. So again, using that curved edge, I'm going to take my split gusset lining and I'm going to put it right sides together, and I'm going to match the center point on the curved edge of that gusset up with the bottom center point on my main panel lining. I'm going to put a couple clips right down here at the bottom middle part. And then once I have that started, I'm going to take this and bring it up to this top corner. So the very end of my split gusset, that corner, and then the top corner of the main panel lining. I'm going to clip those together, and I'm going to do this for both sides of the straight edges here until I get close to this bottom rounded curve. So I'm going to keep clipping and then we'll come back. So I have now clipped along these straight sides and the straight portion of the bottom, and I just have the curved corners remaining. Before I clip that, I am going to make some snips no more than about 1/4 of an inch into the gusset, and this is going to help so that I can ease the gusset around these curves and get everything sitting really nice and flush. So you can see that gives me a little bit more ease in there. And then I can go ahead and finish clipping around this bottom corner curve. And I'm going to do the same exact thing then with the other bottom corner. Everything is now clipped together with my one split gusset lining piece and a main panel lining. I'm going to go ahead and take this to my sewing machine, but I am going to have a variable seam allowance. So I'm going to start the seam allowance at one of these corners at 3/8 of an inch. Then once I get down past at least an inch of sewing, I'm going to gradually increase the seam allowance to about 1/2 an inch. Then we're going to sew all the way down, being very careful around these curves that everything is laying nicely. So along the bottom edge, around my second curve, still at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, until I get just about a little more than an inch or two away from this end. And I'm going to decrease my seam allowance again back to 3/8 of an inch to finish, making sure I backstitch at the beginning and end. So I now have the first curved edge of one of my split gusset lining pieces connected to a main panel lining. And now I'm going to start attaching our divider pocket. At this point, it doesn't really matter which way your zipper tape goes. That's going to matter more when we attach the full interior of the bag to the full exterior of the bag. So for now, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to have mine to the left though. And so I'm going to match the bottom center point of my divider pocket up with the center point on what should now be the straight edge of a split gusset lining that is connected to your main panel lining. And I'm just going to clip at the bottom first. Next, I'm going to be using those 5-inch marks I made from the top edge here. So there is my mark right there, and I'm going to match that up with the top corner of my divider pocket. And we're going to clip that together and just put a couple there. And then same on the other side. You could unzip this a little bit just to make sure you don't get your zipper pull caught in your stitching at all. And so again, I'm clipping the divider pocket to the straight edge of the split gusset at that 5-inch down mark. I'm going to keep clipping along the straighter edges, and then just like before, when I get to these curves, I'm going to make some snips in the curves of just the gusset piece here so that I can then ease around these curves. So I'm going to go ahead, keep clipping, snip into the gusset, and continue clipping around the curves. That is all clipped together, going all the way around the curves. So now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to flip it over. I find it easier if we are sewing from the gusset side, but you don't have to start at the very top. We're just going to start at the top of where our divider pocket is, and we're going to actually baste this at just 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll finish sewing it when we attach the other gusset lining piece. So we're going to take this to the machine and now baste, starting at the top of where our divider pocket is, all the way around here until we get to the other end or corner of our divider pocket, basting at 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the divider pocket is now basted to one of our split gusset lining pieces. We're going to take our other split gusset lining and making sure you're working with the long straight edge, not the long curved edge right now. So I'm using the long straight edge, and I'm going to match up the center point of the straight edge of that split gusset lining and clip it to the bottom center point of our divider pocket. And we're clipping this together, right sides together. Then I'm going to take it and, similar to how we did before, we're going to match up these top corners. Only now it's the top corners of both of the split gusset lining pieces rather than just at the top of our divider pocket. We're going to do that on both sides. And then you can double check that everything is lining up correctly. The 5-inch down mark you made on this one should be matching up with where, again, the top of your divider pocket is and where your other 5-inch mark was. And so we can clip that together. And I'm going to go ahead and do the other side and then continue clipping at least along the straight parts of these edges. I have all of the straight edges clipped now, and just as we have with our other gussets so far, we're going to make some small snips into the portion of the gusset that is going to go around those bottom curved corners. Again, no more than 1/4 inch long snips. And once I make those snips into the gusset, I will be able to now ease around the curves and continue clipping this so that the whole split gusset lining is clipped in place. I now have this clipped all the way around, including around these curves. Now I'm going to be taking this and sewing it on my machine at 3/8 inch seam allowance, going from this top corner all the way down around these curves back to the top to that other top corner. As you're sewing though, there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. You want to make sure you're only sewing through this part of the bag. Don't accidentally sew through your main lining here or catch like this part of the seam allowance in there. And also when you're going around these curves, I find it's helpful to kind of feel underneath and kind of push down to make sure that the gusset is laying nicely both on the side that you are looking at as you're sewing, as well as on the underside, because you've already basted this in place, but you want to make sure you don't end up creating any pulls or kinks in your fabric as you're now sewing it at that slightly bigger seam allowance of 3/8 inch. And make sure again, as you go around those curves, that you are keeping this part of the bag, the main lining part, out of the way. So we're going to sew all the way around there at 3/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I have sewn that kind of middle seam of our gusset to our divider pocket, and now we just need to attach our other main panel lining. So first, I'm going to take my main panel lining and I'm going to measure 2 3/4 inch or 2.75 from our center point on both sides of that center point, which is going to make a 5.5 inch gap. And we are actually going to leave an opening here so that we can turn the bag right side out on our final bag assembly. Once we have those points marked, we're going to take what we've assembled of our lining so far. We're going to match up our bottom center points again, just as we have been doing. And then we're going to match up our top corners and clip those together. Same for the other side. And then I'm going to continue clipping along our straight edges, just as before, until we get to those bottom curves. So I continued clipping along the straight portions of this panel. Now, something you'll see here is I still clipped along the full length of the bottom, even though we're actually going to be leaving a gap in this bottom part when we sew. You still want to clip along everything really well to make sure that everything is going to line up correctly. So again, just as before, I'm going to make small snips in this gusset piece so that we are able to ease around our curves. And then I'm going to ease around those curves and continue clipping in place. And I'm going to do the same thing with that other bottom corner curve. Now that everything is clipped in place, I'm ready to sew. I recommend flipping this over, and we're gonna sew from this side, so from the gusset side, so we can get really well around these bottom curves. And make sure you are keeping everything else out of the way so you don't get anything caught in your stitching. Now, similar to before, when I sewed my first main panel lining, I'm going to start at this top corner with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, but then gradually ease out to 1/2 inch seam allowance and continue coming down this side and around this corner. But when I get to the point that I marked down here for my gap, I'm going to stop and back stitch. Then I'm going to skip over that section, leaving a gap where it is not sewn together. Start sewing again with 1/2 inch seam allowance, come around this curve until I get back up to this other corner and ease back down to 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now, I just showed you from this side because it's a bit easier to see, but I do suggest, as I said, sewing from this side. So again, starting at 3/8 inch seam allowance, increase to 1/2 inch, come down around this corner, stop when we get to the marks we've made, leave a gap, sew again, starting at 1/2 inch seam allowance, all the way around, and gradually decrease when you get to that last inch or two to 3/8 inch seam allowance to finish it off. Everything for this version of the interior is now sewn together. So you can see I have the assembled gusset with our divider pocket inside of there. And we've also left a gap that we're going to use later when we turn the bag right side out. So the one thing we have left to do on here is just to trim down these seam allowances. Now we're gonna start about an inch down from the top. The reason we're not starting at the very top is actually because leaving that little bit at the top is going to make it easier to kind of shift the gusset where we want it when we're sewing the interior and exterior of the bag together. So I'm going to trim down these seam allowances to about 1/4 inch, trimming around these curves as well. However, when we get to the part where we left a gap, do not trim that seam allowance. So I'm going to kind of just go up a little bit there, and I'm going to leave the full seam allowance there because that's going to help later when we go ahead and sew that together. So I'm going to trim the seam allowance on this side as well as this middle gusset where we had our divider pocket, and then also on that other main panel and gusset. We're going to trim all of those seam allowances down to about 1/4 inch or about 1/2 the seam allowance. Once all of these seam allowances are trimmed up, we are finished for now with this version of our lining or version of our interior. If you are making the interior of your bag without a divider pocket, then you're going to have 2 of your main panel linings, and then you're just going to have a solid lining gusset. It's just all one piece like this. And so I'm going to show how we assemble that interior now. The first thing we need to do is mark some center points. So I've gone ahead and made small notches. You could also use a marking pen to mark both the bottom and top center point of my main panel linings. And then also marking the center points along both of the long curved edges of that lining gusset. Next, we're going to take one of those main panel linings with that right side up and lay our gusset lining right sides together and match up our center points along that bottom edge. And just put that in place. And then I'm going to match up the top corners of the gusset lining with the top corners of that main panel lining piece on both sides. And then I'm going to go ahead and continue clipping around here along these straight portions of the edges. So I'm going to keep clipping until I get down to these bottom curves. I've clipped this together along the straight edges of the main panel lining, and now I have the bottom curved corners remaining. So I'm going to make some snips into the gusset lining, no more than about 1/4 inch, and that's going to help ease around those curves so that I can finish clipping that into place. So I'm going to make these snips, and I'm going to go ahead and finish clipping this together. Now that everything is clipped together for this first main panel lining and our lining gusset piece, I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and sew from the corner down around to the other top corner. As I do this, I'm going to start with 3/8 inch seam allowance at this top corner here for about the first inch or so, and then I'm going to gradually increase the seam allowance to 1/2 inch. I'm going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance down the side, around the bottom curve, across the bottom, around the other curve, back up the other side, and then again, when I get to about the last inch or so, I'm going to decrease the seam allowance back down to 3/8 of an inch. So that first main panel lining is sewn to our gusset, and I'm going to take my other main panel lining, and I'm going to make some marks 2 3/4 inches, so 2.75 inches from that bottom center point on either side. So this is going to be marking where we're going to be sewing or leaving a 5.5 inch gap when we go and sew these together. And this opening is going to be left so that we can turn the bag right side out later. Once we've made those marks, we're going to go ahead and start the same way we did before. So I'm going to clip the bottom center points of the main panel lining to the remaining edge of the gusset lining. And then I'm going to clip the top corners together. And I'm going to continue clipping until I have all of these straight edges clipped, leaving just the curves for now. So everything is clipped except, again, where the gusset's going to go around these bottom curves. So just like I did on the other side, I'm going to make some small snips in the gusset, no more than 1/4 inch long. And then I will be able to finish clipping around these curves. So everything is now clipped together for this second main panel lining. You'll notice that I did still clip along this bottom edge. Even though we're going to be leaving a gap here in the sewing, it's important that we clip the entire way around to make sure that everything is lined up correctly. Now to sew this, similar to how we did the other side, we're going to start up here at this top corner at 3/8 inch seam allowance and then increase to 1/2 inch seam allowance. Come down this side around this bottom curve, and then when you get to the mark that you've made for that 5.5 inch gap, you're going to stop and back stitch, leave an opening, start sewing again at the other mark you made at 1/2 inch seam allowance, come around this curve, up the side, and then again when we get to that last inch or so, decrease the seam allowance back down to 3/8 inch seam allowance. So we now have both panels sewn to our solid gusset lining, and you can see I have left a gap in the bottom that we're going to use when we turn the bag right side out when we get to the final bag assembly. So now we're going to trim down the seam allowance. Do not trim the seam allowance where you left this gap, and also we're going to leave the seam allowance just for about the first inch at each of our top edges, which is going to help to make it a little easier when we want to kind of lay the seam allowances in the right direction on our final bag assembly. So I'm going to trim down the rest of the seam allowance though to about 1/4 inch, making sure I don't accidentally cut through anything that I don't want to cut through. And again, we're not going to cut the seam allowance where we left this gap. The lining of the bag is now assembled, and we're going to go ahead and install our magnetic snaps. Regardless of whether you are doing the lining without the divided pocket or with the divider pocket, you're going to be installing your snaps in the same way. So for installing our magnetic snaps, I first recommend fusing a small scrap of Deco Light or a similar stabilizer to the wrong side of our bag. So we're going to measure down from our top center mark on the wrong side of the lining and just make a mark here. And we're going to fuse our scrap of Deco Light right over top of that mark, and then you can remake the mark if you need to, if you can no longer see it. But we're going to go ahead and fuse that, making sure that we're not right up against the edge because we don't want to get that caught on our seam allowance. So I have my scrap of Deco Light fused on there. I can still pretty much see the mark through my stabilizer, but just if you can't, you can go ahead and again mark that point 1 inch down from the center mark. Then you're going to go ahead and install your magnetic snaps, whether that be the rivet style or the traditional style with the prongs, using that point as your marker. Now that the magnetic snaps are installed on our lining is all done, and we're gonna move on. Now to assemble the exterior of the bag. So you should have your gusset put together at this point. So this is going to be put together exactly the same way, whether you're using the solid exterior gusset like this one or the pieced exterior gusset like this one. We're going to do the same exact steps. So if you're using the pieced exterior gusset and you have the seam in the bottom, you're going to already know what your center point is. If not, you're going to want to mark that center point now. I already have mine with that seam, but if you need to, go ahead and mark that. Then on your exterior main panels, again, because I did the pieced version here, then on the exterior main panel, Again, because I did the pieced version, I have this center seam, but if you don't have that center seam, you can go ahead and just use a marking pen or cut small notches to mark your center points both for the bottom and top of that main panel. Now, especially if you are using the pieced gusset and maybe you have a zipper pocket on one side but not on the other like I do here, you are going to want to think about which one you want to be on the left versus right side of your bag. And also if you have for your main panels, if you have a bag tag on one, or maybe you had a certain fabric placement you wanted to be the front versus the back, make sure you're thinking about that. So I'm working right now with the front panel of my bag. This is going to be the front main panel because I want my bag tag to be on the front. And then for my gusset, I want my zipper pocket, because I only have one, to end up on the left side of the bag. So that means that it needs to be lined up on this edge of the bag, and that way when it's finished, it's going to be on the left side, with this being the front panel. So just take a moment to think about exactly how you want things to line up. So I kind of think about it that, okay, I want this to be on the left. So now if I kind of take this whole thing and flip it around, like the bag would be inside out, right? And now I know which way I need to lay my gusset. So we're gonna lay the gusset over top of the main panel, right sides together, and match up the bottom center point of the main panel with the center point of the exterior gusset. And we're gonna go ahead and clip that together. I have that bottom middle part clipped, and then I'm going to clip together the top corners here on both sides. And then I'm going to continue clipping along the straight edges of the panel. So along these straight edges and a bit more across the bottom along those straight edges. I have all those straight edges clipped, and now I just have these bottom curves. But in order to make this lay really nicely, we're going to make some small snips, no more than 1/4 inch along the gusset edge. And then that will allow us to get that to really ease nicely into the curve. And we're going to go ahead and clip that all into place as well. All right, so now I have it clipped all the way around, including those curves, and it's time to take this and sew. So I'm going to start up at this top corner, sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. So I'm going to come down around the side, around this bottom curve, across the bottom, around the other curve, and back up to the other top corner. So the first side of our exterior is sewn together, and now we're going to do exactly the same thing with the other side. So we're going to start by clipping together our bottom center points, then our top corners, clip all the way around, and make sure you make some snips in your gusset when you get to those curves. All right, I have that second side all clipped, and we're going to go ahead and sew that exactly the same as the other side, 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. All right, so our exterior is all assembled, and we are going to go ahead and join our lining or interior with our exterior of our bag. So we now have our entire exterior of the bag assembled and put together, and we have our entire lining assembled and put together, and we get to put these two things together into our final bag. So we're going to turn the exterior of the bag so it is right side out, just as it will be in the final bag. And then our lining is going to be just as it will also be in the final bag, with the correct side of the fabric on the inside. Now, if you are doing the divider pocket, we do need to pay attention to our orientation at this point. So if you're using the divider pocket in here, I at least prefer to have my zipper close to the left when I'm looking at the front of the bag. So as long as you want that orientation as well, I'm going to be holding this so that means this is the front part of the bag because the zipper is closing to the left. Now I'm actually going to be taking the exterior of the bag and putting it inside the lining so that our fabrics are right side together and we can sew the entire top part of the bag together. So you will have to kind of scrunch up your bag. Now again, this is the front of my bag. This is going to be the front of the lining, so I need to make sure that those edges are put together. If you are using the divider pocket, your exterior, like the bulk of your exterior, will kind of all be smushed in one side of the divider pocket. It doesn't matter which side of that divider pocket it's kind of smushed into, because this is just temporary while we're clipping everything together. But just realize that it's obviously going to have to be smushed on one side or the other. If you're not using the divider pocket, you'll have plenty of space in there. So I'm going to start by clipping together the top center points of the main panels of the exterior and lining. So I did that side, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for this other side. You just kind of have to shift the fabric around as you're doing this. After we have these center points clipped together, we're going to go to our tops sides parts here. So looking at these top parts of the gusset, I'm gonna kind of pull it so that it lays flat. It can also be helpful. Earlier we marked the top center point of our gusset end piece, and in this case I have a seam on the end of this gusset. You could also have marked it, but since I have the divider pocket, I have a middle point marked. You don't necessarily need to have that middle point, but it can be helpful. Then we're going to match up these corners, and you see that our seam allowances should match up here. We are going to orient this so that the seam for the lining goes in towards the middle of the gusset and the seam allowance for the exterior goes out. So we're nesting, we're nesting these seams, and we're going to clip that. And same with the other side. So lining is coming in, exterior is going out. Just like that, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Once we have those initial edges clipped together at our midpoints and these top corners, we're going to go ahead and continue clipping around the bag, making sure that we line up the curves along the top edges really nicely. So I kind of just pull it so they get taut, and then that should allow you to clip together really nicely. And we're just going to continue clipping all the way around the rest of these top edges of the bag. I have that entire top edge clipped together now, and I'm going to go ahead and take this to my sewing machine and sew around this entire edge at 3/8 inch seam allowance. Take your time as you go around the curved portions. Whenever you get to a corner, make sure you put down your needle, pivot, and then continue sewing so you can get a nice sharp corner at those points. And use a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Try to keep that really consistent as you go all the way around the top of the bag. So I now have that whole top edge of the bag sewn, and I'm gonna go ahead and just trim down part of this seam allowance. There's a couple places you want to focus on. These top corners can have a lot of bulk, and we want to be able to get those turned really nice and cleanly, so I like to trim those down really well. So right at those top corners, make sure you don't cut into your stitching at all. And then we're also going to trim along our curved top edges. You can trim this with regular scissors, and then you could also cut some little notches in it, or you could just use pinking shears to trim that down and reduce the bulk in that curve. So I did go ahead and use some pinking shears on that edge, and I made sure I trim up these corners, and then I'm going to turn the whole bag right side out through the hole we left in the lining earlier. Keep in mind that as you are turning this right side out, if you have a divider pocket, it's going to look kind of weird, and so you get that pushed down into the lining. You also want to make sure that you push out from the inside those top corners. So it can be very helpful to use some kind of a turning tool. I usually just use this chopstick. I'm going to really get those corners nice and clean. There we go. You also can feel on the inside. I'm feeling on the inside with my hand, and I'm making sure that, again, my seam allowance of the lining is laying going this way and the exterior is going the other way. That way we don't have bulk anywhere. And as I am pushing these corners out and making sure everything is laying correctly, you can also go ahead and start clipping these edges, especially at these corners, just again to make sure everything is laying properly. Grab a couple clips here, make sure that these corners and the top edge of this gusset piece is going to lay nicely. And then I can go ahead and do the other side as well. Same thing, making sure to really push out those corners and make sure that the seams are laying in the right direction. Once those top gusset parts are nice and neat, you push the rest of your lining down inside the bag. Make sure all of our exterior edges look good. Oh, sorry. There we go. Great. And now I'm going to continue clipping along my top edges. I roll the seams in my fingers so that I can make sure that the exterior is on the outside, lining is on the inside, and that we have a nice, neat seam here. So we're going to clip all the way around this top edge so that we can go ahead and top stitch in just a moment. So I have clipped that whole top edge of the bag, and I'm gonna go ahead and take this to my sewing machine and top stitch along this entire top part of the bag. All right, next we do need to close up the opening. So I'm going to pull up the lining where that hole was left and kind of pull it so that we have a straight edge here. I kind of usually like push up on the inside of the seam just past where the opening is so you can see where your seam should sit. And then pinch it together, and we're gonna clip. So the raw edge should be inside the bag, and we're just having these folds on the outside. And we're gonna clip it along that all the way. Okay. Once that is clipped, I'm going to go ahead and take this to my sewing machine. I'm going to top stitch along this edge 1/8 inch seam allowance to close up that opening. So the bag is assembled, exterior and lining are together. Now we just need to do our O-ring connectors need to be finished off, and we need to create our shoulder strap. So all we have left now is to assemble or create our strap, and then to attach that strap to our finished bag. So I'm going to take my strap. I've already created a crease here, but we're going to be marking down the middle. So you could do that by pressing, or we can do it by measuring and marking with a marking pen. So we're gonna measure 1.5 inches in, which is gonna mark the halfway point down the middle, length of our strap. Now we're going to be folding the raw edges into that middle line. And then we're going to be folding it again in half. So you can use some double-sided tape here to hold these raw edges in, or a lot of the time what I will actually do is I will kind of do it all at once. I will fold it into the middle and then fold it again. And I'm going to clip it, and I'm going to continue as I go. But as I said, another way to do this would be to put double-sided tape on either side of that center line, fold in these raw edges, and stick them down to our double-sided tape, and then you will have the strap at half the width at that point. And then when you fold it again, you're going to end up with a strap that is 3/4 of an inch wide. I have the entire strap clipped together, and I'm going to go ahead and take it and sew. I'm going to top stitch at 1/8 inch seam allowance along both of the long edges. My strap is now sewn, and I'm going to assemble it further by attaching the O-rings. So first I'm going to fold it in by 1/2 inch on one of the short ends. So I've already made a mark here. I'm going to slide my O-ring onto the strap, and I'm going to fold it in by 1/2 inch. Then you're going to measure down another inch from that folded edge. And again, I've already made my mark for it. And we're going to fold along that mark too. And now we're going to be enclosing the raw edge and the O-ring in that fold. Now I'm going to measure 3/8 of an inch down from the first fold we made, which is the one that's now laying on top of the strap. So we're going to measure down 3/8 of an inch and in the center across the strap. So 3/8 of an inch right here. And I'm going to go ahead and punch a hole for a rivet. I punched a hole for the rivet. I'm going to go ahead and install my rivet through all of those layers. And then I can go ahead and set that rivet as well. So this end of the strap is done, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other end of the strap. So I now have this strap all finished with my O-rings and rivets in both ends of the strap. I do want to note here, and it is noted in the pattern, that if you prefer, you can use metal strap ends at the end of your straps. And if you choose to do this, you're just going to fold the strap over one time at 1.5 inch instead of doing those 2 folds that we did to hide the exposed raw end of the strap. Either way, we now have a strap that has our O-rings on the ends, and I'm now going to show how we're going to attach this strap to our bag. So all we have left to do now is attach our strap to the bag. I've already attached it on one side, and now I will show you how to attach it on the other. So we're going to take our O-ring connector and you're going to fold it so it is right about at the seam where you sewed it into the bag. And then we're going to fold it up again, just like that. Then I'm going to measure about 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the fold. And we're going to mark in the middle of that connector. And then I'm going to punch a hole for the rivet through all of these layers. So through this O-ring connector as well as through both the exterior and lining of our gusset here. I have my hole punched for the rivet and I'm gonna get ready to set the rivet. I do want to make a quick note here though. So I am using O-rings that are able to open. So these are O-ring clips. And that is suggested in the pattern, but you can also use solid O-rings. So if you are using the clips, you are going to be able to install and set your rivet now, and then you can just clip the O-ring onto our connector. However, if you are using a solid O-ring here, after you punch your hole for your rivet, you're gonna want to open this back up, put your O-ring on to the fold of the connector, fold this back up, and then you're going to install and set your rivet once the O-ring is already attached to the bag. But because I have a connector, I'm going to be able to set it first. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So if again you're using a solid O-ring, not a clip, you will already have this attached, but I had not. I used the clip style. So I'm going to be able to go ahead and clip it on to the bag now. And there we go. Now my bag is finished. There is my Amour shoulder bag.